we wanted to take advantage of being in San Diego, being in California, to have a conversation with people who have presumably something to say about outside of school chat and learning. So I want to start off, I want to ask everyone a question, and I'm going to ask a few questions and then open it up for all of us to continue the interview or the conversation. I mean, I keep thinking of three things while I'm here at this conference where there's so little discussion topics on outside of school. The first thing I think of is that by different people's estimates, they kind of center around one thing, which is that only 25% of the life of children and youth is spent in school. That means 75% is not. And so that means there's a lot of learning life outside of school. And yet so there's obsession with school. And does learning take place, and who do schools fail, and so on. Very important, but more attention could be paid to the learning lives of young people outside of school. The second thing I think of is how quantitatively and qualitatively how much learning and development goes on prior to school, and what a rich non-school environment human beings have created for infants and babies and preschoolers. And the third is how much clear positive benefit there has been documented about outside of school programming and outside of school rich cultural experiences, whether they're programmed or not. So I think of those three things and how relatively little impact they have had on educational research. And I think that the work of the people here is some of the best, and I wanted us to address both how come you got into that work, what do you think the limitations are to it having a larger impact on what goes on in schools. And I would ask you first to address the first part of that question of how come you sometimes or always do research on out of school time, sometimes or always, and to respond both professionally and personally. Whoever wants to start. Oh, just the first one.
Are you part of this discussion?
I was the interviewer, but I can do whatever.
Why don't you start?
Quite a cool move, Mike. He's very cool. Cool man. Well, everybody, you know, that at the very moment you tell a particular story. So I think that for me, years ago, or however, somewhere in the 3 decades plus, I don't know exactly what year it was, but I was working with some people who were doing political organizing in the very poorest communities of New York City, and had in fact organized a union of unemployed and welfare people. Thought that since they were impacted on by budget cuts, they should have a union just as workers should. And one of the things that happened was mothers who were being organized to become leaders, not just to get their lights turned on, which is what they wanted, but to become activists and leaders, came to us, the people who were developing this, and said, are our kids have nothing to do. Can you create something for them to do? And I can't remember everything, but I know, having been introduced in a real meaningful, life-changing way to Pagatsky's work from Mike, and probably just realizing the value and the insight he had about play and what I have taken to call performance. We thought, well, what would they want to do? Play basketball, they could do lots of things, but where can kids be creative? One of the few places they can still be creative is on the stage. They love to be on the stage. They love the competition on the stage. So we began this program called the All-Stars Talent Show Network, which now is spread to 8 or 9 cities, and Holland, and expanded. The organization has expanded its programs, but the idea was if they can perform on the stage, they can create new performances in life. And it's been a successful program. So personally for me, I think it was the impact of hundreds of poor mothers saying their kids had nothing to do. And professionally, you can separate them for a minute, but the excitement of trying out a methodology that was taking something that they loved to do and where they could be creative, and seeing if you could challenge them with a new performance of create your organization, create your talent show.
Okay, I guess that's it. Thanks. I went to graduate school as an older student, 10 years older than my cohort, 10, 12 years older. One of my cohorts back there, I'm 12 years older than her. Beautiful Angela Valenzuela. And I was going to study the issue of dropouts. And because I had been a teacher, and I was concerned that why were so many students failing, Latinos in particular, and that drove me to seek graduate school to figure out the problem. My first quarter at Stanford University, I read Psychology of Literacy, and it changed my life. Of course, I had to have a mediator, who was Luis Moll, who put me in touch with Michael Cole, who made it possible for me to finish, when I finished, to come to San Diego and work as his, come in and work at the lab as a fellow, which many of you have done probably, and has changed your life. I was stricken by the idea of the fifth dimension in the way that it provided all this opportunity for experimentation, and that you could tweak it in all of these ways to help children learn. And my concern went back to the issue of dropouts. And he had already attempted to enter into the Mexicano community, which was, as I said many times in my work, a mile away from the fifth dimension, but worlds apart. And he tried successfully at times to bring in the Latino community, but they would go back. The kids would, they wouldn't stay. Recruiting was a problem, keeping them was a problem. So I came in and it was just like, this is where I was supposed to be. And with the ideas that, how could this project, how could this innovative learning environment be created so that these children could succeed, which is something that the school was not being able to do, not have that kind of success. What could these children tell us, teach us about learning and development and success in school? That was something that took over my life. for 10 years, I didn't look up and, oh my God, 10 years have gone by. But in the process of working with the community in a very different way, of incorporating the community, coming from more of a bilingual background, literacy background, from multi-literacy perspective, the Mexicano community, and having come from that community, also changed the way we were thinking about the fifth dimension. That when we took the fifth dimension to the community and say, oh, we're gonna do this thing called the fifth dimension, we have a wizard, they thought I was crazy. They did, and we have some documentation where the woman after all these years. But they didn't understand all this, and immediately thought that we should change the name. It didn't come from me. They thought that it was too fanciful, that the kids wouldn't understand, so they called it La Clase Mágica. And from that moment on, because I practiced very much what Mike had done in his community, is just to have these community meetings and bring the people in and talk about, what the language, the culture, how could we make this theirs? And because I was a postdoctoral fellow, I knew that I didn't know if I was going to be able to stay. I had 2 years. And so we started with this idea of, well, I may not be able to stay, so you have to learn how to do this in case I leave. And then I got the job, and then continue. I don't know, I may not get tenure, and so that has been hard. So, but that goes to the idea that it was this evolving thing, that the values, the philosophy, the structure was evolving with the needs, with the understanding about what we were doing. And so it's been 20 years. And it's vibrant. The idea, the basic core of the fifth dimension as protean, and in the words of Shirley Heath, I remember learning that word from her, protean, that was the fifth dimension, that it took this shape according to who was tweaking it, the context in which it was set in, and all of this was taking place. So for me, it's been a passion because and there's been a lot of struggle. It hasn't been easy. Getting tenure, and when you devote so much time to a project that it doesn't really get that much recognition, as you say. That I'm in a Department of Communication where we have these world-known theorists. I'm doing practice. I'm learning about this new theory. And all of these things, it was a struggle. It wasn't easy to do. But the changes, the transformation that is taking place before our very eyes, anecdotally, the kids engaged in the activities and coming back and helping us change. All of that is just, it still drives me. I still spend an enormous amount of time, and at the same time having to publish along this. So it's been, if I die tomorrow, I'm going to die happy because I have served not only my community, but my university. Well, I'm going to live you by 20 years. See, I'm going to get my 20 years.
She said in the last meeting she's going to outlive me by 20 years. Can you imagine that? She's up here in this meeting says, if I die tomorrow. Not only that, but she's supposed to see how she got started on this, not how she finished.
Anyway, it's been that kind of thing that it's just very nourishing. At the same time, it takes so much. But when you see these kids, we did a study, what we call a sustainability study, and interviewed 20 former students, children, participants, who are now in their 20s, and 90% of them had some level of college. 30% of them were going to graduate school. This is higher than the general population. And when you have these kinds of results, you know, you think, this is a life well lived.
I'll try to be coherent at the end of a very long weekend day. I've been working in these spaces for at least 21 years, since I was a graduate student. And I did them for both, I think for pragmatic and political reasons, most often. And of course, academic reasons, trying to create some. I was always really literally working in these hybrid spaces because they were programs within schooling institutions. And I started out doing them at the university level. In spaces that could open up, and I always saw these spaces as places for innovation and resistance to the kind of teaching and practices that the provisionally admitted, the non-dominant students with whom I have worked, were not having access to. They were not having access to really meaningful kinds of learning experiences. So mine started in a university setting, creating programs, summer programs, learning centers, spaces that still had some legitimacy but always marginal, on the margins of the academy. And just enough in the academy that I could use resources, just far out enough that I could get away with things because they didn't really pay attention too much to what I was doing. So that really has been essential to think about these ways in which students who generally don't have access to this kind of learning and participation would have opportunity. And they worked in academic contexts. They worked in literacy. They worked in the science programs we developed. They worked in the mathematical programs that we were part of. Always using the very principles of informal learning, but doing them kind of in quasi-institutional settings. And probably one of the reasons that motivated me most to continue doing them is that not only did the participants, the students benefit, but the adults who participated in them always seemed to benefit more. The graduate students, the undergraduate students, the colleagues, they were somehow, their learning trajectories were always more steep than even the very participants who were the object of the programs. And so you could see sometimes more rapid transformation in the adults who were working in them. And that really, I think, is exciting because you have real hope and possibility when you get to see that kind of change going on. And you know that there's a possibility that those people are going to go out and try to reproduce that somewhere else, try to do some version of it somewhere, right? There's a kind of new sensibility, if not the same thing, a new stance, a new sensibility about what it means to think about learning and having fun and doing this in important ways. And I think that really set the foundation for kind of a career, a whole history of a professional life of doing that kind of work. And of course, I discovered Vygotsky in my dissertation in writing, and so that made it help provided new ways of thinking about how to do this work. We were doing what Mike would later call re-mediation long before I knew the theoretical construct. To start to really think about it in new ways to help, again, students who had been marginalized in the schooling processes. So coming to UCLA as a postdoc, trying to really get a handle on these theories, I remember finding out that Mike was down the road. And I thought, well, that's really silly. He's really pretty close, and here I am at UCLA, and that's the very thing that I think I want to know most. So I called him one day, and I told him, I'm an assistant professor at UCLA, and he said, well, then just come on down. And so that's what I did with another graduate student. We came every single week to be part of the lab for 3 years without fail, working with Olga and Mike and Uriah. And really kind of getting some newer and better and deeper understandings of the work we were trying to do and how to use it. And it was in that period that the fifth dimension,
20 years.
Anyway, a long time ago. The idea of the fifth dimension emerged. Now, in the meantime, I had been doing programs for migrant farm worker students at UCLA. Again, that same model, that same kind of idea that had started way back in graduate school. Those were continued. So I've never really stuck with just one form. So we've had the UC Links program, as well as different programs like the migrant program for high school students. But being part of that consortium, the fifth dimension, from the very beginning, had the same kind of results. It had a wonderful effect on the children. I started working in a school that I had been doing literacy research in, so we had already established a nice relationship, and I still collaborate regularly with the principal, who's a very good friend. But I also saw what it did to graduate students. What I saw it do to postdocs who were part of these environments. Certainly gives me, but it gave them meaning. It gave them purpose and understandings that we just couldn't provide in the seminars and in the traditional kind of academic work that was usually afforded for graduate students. So once again, those same things of being able to make some small contribution to communities, and being able to really help generate and work with a whole new generation of young scholars about thinking about their work differently and thinking about what it means to do this kind of work with their professors, and how we could really challenge those dichotomies that the institution forces us to live in about being in communities, doing good, rigorous research, and really good teaching. I mean, I think the UC Links model has really been instrumental in kind of challenging regularly. That model is presented to us every time we go up for review, right? The three very separate legs of the stool. And these kinds of programs just push that whole notion away, just really challenge it, and force us not to just think about it, but to live our lives very differently. And then I think it becomes so natural and normalized that you don't know another way of doing things. You can't imagine doing your work and not having one of these kinds of projects to work with. It seems impossible to do. So that's why we're still doing that, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to try to model a different kind of answer, and it's fairly short, and I'm going to answer it 3 times. Okay, the first is that neither of my parents completed high school, and both were intellectuals and social activists. So I had a second one was, maybe 4. Second one was, I really disliked being in school, and I arranged by the time I reached high school to be able to leave at 12 o'clock every day and play tennis until dark. So I really liked not being in school. Second. Third one is a theoretical one, and that is that I became, because of work that I did in Africa, because I went to Russia, and because of a bunch of other stuff that was all tangled together, I became deeply suspicious of the inferences drawn from psychological tests, which by my analysis were drawn from schooling and then imposed on the non-school world. And I set out to try to do research on that, and Lois was involved in that research. And that took us outside of school part of the time. And we found out that if you moved outside of school and outside of tests, the analytic machinery of educational psychology and psychology came apart and had to be rebuilt on some other basis. And so that's 3. And the fourth one was that Bud Meehan and Peg Griffin fucked up one afternoon and got us kicked out of school, doing research in school, and they came back. They came back to the lab and said, we just got kicked out of school, and we got all this money, and we got these people hired. What the hell are we going to do? And that got us into working with kids after school. Those were all for actually a special audience, but This is verifiable if you want to take the time to verify it.
Well, I'm glad I get to speak next. To revise history as necessary. I think my presence here gives new meaning to what Levin Wenger talked about as legitimate peripheral participation. Which part? I'm leaving it open. Illegitimate, right? Illegitimate. Whether I'm a legitimate or illegitimate participant in chat activities is what I'm referring. Second observation has to go under the heading of until the revolution. And by that, I mean schooling, as much as we abuse it, disabuse it, is a legitimate, the legitimate institution in American society and most other industrialized society for determining people's outcomes in lives. And it's very explicit about that. School is all about sorting. It's all about sorting. The manifest ideology in American society is one of achievement, right? It's a matter of how hard people work and whether they perform well on a variety of tests and the rest. Now, sociological and sociocultural analysis, of course, debunks that and points out that social class and race and ethnicity and gender play much more important roles in that sorting mechanism than people's hard work and effort. But nevertheless, schooling resides in American society and other industrial societies as the mechanism by which sorting is done. And I take that fact as something we have to deal with, right down the middle. So I celebrate all the work that is done in non-school settings as really instructive for and beautiful and making people's lives more interesting, more productive, more involved. But I keep coming back to the fact that we have to make linkages between those kind of activities and this institution that we have set up that does do the sorting. Otherwise, the reproduction of inequality that exists paramount in American society will continue. And I come back, it's interesting, Mike just invoked the African work, because his work was one of the ones that got me tangled up in this idea. I guess in one way it's his fault too, right, for other reasons. Little biography, I read his cultural context book and wrote him a very formal letter when he was at Rockefeller University, because I thought he was an old man. Right? I mean, because the book...
You probably even think so now.
I do. Mike's in a different decade than I am. No, I seriously, the way that it was this elegant book, it was, so full of rich material and deep insight. It had to be written by this old guy. So I wrote a very formal letter to him. And just like Chris said, he said, come on down, except that was Rock U in New York, right? And I too was a beginning assistant professor at the time this happened. And so Courtney Kasdan, who was doing, was in San Diego as a teacher going back into the classroom. And we were funded by Marge Martis at the Ford Foundation. And poor Courtney, we were into this classroom study about 1 week. And Marge said, oh, go to New York and talk to Mike. I said, oh my God, I'm going to have to go to Rock. And one of the things I learned through that, of course, was that the idea that Mike just alluded to, that people in weaving contexts and other kinds of naturally occurring activities are doing wonderfully in one kind of setting, but when asked to, quote, transfer their knowledge to another, it wasn't working very well. So that, I think, is, and Bill DeBuff's work in sociolinguistics shows much the same kind of things, that you can see elegant, symbolic, abstract speech in the Black English vernacular in informal settings, but the same kids put into the formality of school don't. So that's a perplexing issue. And I've been trying to wrestle with that for a long period of time. For a whole long time in my biography, I think it's fair to say, one of the things about a speech like this is that you tend to simplify and make much more rational a life that is not that way at all. You bump from place to place and well, I moved from this way. But I think it's fair to say that for a long time in my life, I studied inequality and documented the ways in which school practice and other practices reproduced inequality. And I got to the point where that wasn't satisfying enough. And Pedro and I were talking a little bit earlier about the avid work that we did, which to me was kind of a shift. This looked like an activity that was actually engaged in trying to do something different about that. And then we've taken the ideas there, which I've come to call detracting, out of the Avid work, and we've set up 2 schools now, almost 3. One on our campus, which some of you visited today, which is aimed exclusively at preparing youngsters, low-income students of color, to go to college, which is as legitimate an activity as we possibly can do. We're trying to do it in different ways. And then more recently, we've set up a school in southeast San Diego, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in San Diego County, and doing the same kind of thing, but in a neighborhood context. And there is where the juncture between school, after school, and in school really comes to play.